Save on O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner. Get 2 cans of O'Reilly Brake Parts Cleaner for just $8. Valid in-store only at O'Reilly Auto Parts.
O'Reilly Auto Parts.
You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to The Archaeology Show. TAS goes behind the headlines to bring you the real stories about archaeology and the history around us. Welcome to the podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeology Show, episode 160.
On today's show, we talk about Neanderthals, Homo Sapiens, and their intersection in human prehistory.
Let's dig a little deeper into that sweet, sweet genome. Hey everybody, how's it going?
Pretty good. How are you?
I don't know. Whatever. I'm going to stop starting podcasts like that.
Okay.
It's
That's
dumb.
good. Yep.
Because I'm not even talking to the audience. But if you could just email me, Tristan at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com, and tell me how you're doing. That would be great. I'm not Tristan.
We are aware that you are not Tristan.
Right.
But thank you.
Again, hate mail goes to the A Life in Ruins podcast Twitter account.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay. Well, we're going to kick off the first episode of sort of a new, we have a plan for the month, and we're going to see how well this goes, because sometimes when we're doing our article episodes, we do want to spend a little more time on those, and we just never have. And, without a plan, you can't really do anything. So that's what this episode is going to be. One of our past articles episodes, one of our last two, so basically one in February, give or take, is one we're going to deep dive on today.
Yeah, it's just sometimes we're doing these news articles about archaeology, and we only have so much time that we can dedicate to researching about it, and sometimes it's just you just want to know more, and we just don't have time to do that. So this time we decided to take the article that we just talked about, and I think it was in our last episode. It was the French cave findings suggest Europe's first Homo sapiens arrived earlier than thought originally, I believe. That was really interesting to me. And I did a little bit of basic research, but not a lot. And I wanted to know, what is the deal with Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, and how they cross over, and how they mixed, and what the time frame was, and what was actually going on with that, because it's not something I've ever really spent a whole lot of time investigating. So that's what we're planning on doing in this episode today.
Yeah, so, we're not really going to go more into that particular article.
No.
But that article is a jumping off point for discussing the history or evolutionary history of Neanderthals and Homo sapiens, and then a little bit how they intersected mostly in Europe.
Yeah. To find out about that article specifically, go listen to our last episode, and we'll explain why the most recent dates of Homo sapiens in Europe are potentially being pushed back by 10,000 or so years.
Yeah.
But in this episode, we're going to talk about Neanderthals and Homo sapiens and when they came to Europe, and just, some of the bullet points and the highlights about them coming to them interacting and then coming into the continent together. Yeah.
And this is a kind of a thing I've wanted to talk about for a long time, which is basically paleoanthropology, which is the study of ancient humans and their ancestors, because it's not just Homo sapiens, it's all of the Homo and pre-Homo lines.
Right.
And few people may know this because I don't really talk about it a lot on most of my podcasts, which might shock some longtime listeners because I talk about quite a few things.
You're an open book. You've talked about freaking everything.
I know. But when I was in my undergrad, I actually spent a lot of time in an archaeology program, because we didn't really have paleontology at the University of North Dakota. But I spent a lot of time studying the Leakeys first, and then, kind of deep diving on a whole bunch of other paleoanthropological topics. And in fact, my field school I went to was in Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. And Olduvai Gorge is pretty famous for some of the, at the time, earliest hominid species finds going back about 2 million years. Now, of course, we have stuff going back 5-6 million years that's still tied to the Homo sapiens line, or at least we think it is. And also, I've always wanted a paleoanthropology podcast on this network.
Yeah, that would be really cool to have that. There's so much. it's such a large span of time, right? Like we're covering millions of years. That represents the evolutionary timeline for humans, right?
Yeah.
It's a huge amount of time. It's a huge amount of potential species. And there's just so much to talk about. And every time a new site is found, I feel like it changes what we thought of as the human evolutionary tree every time, right? Every time.
Yeah.
So it's just constantly changing. It's so interesting. And there's so much to talk about there.
Yeah. And of course, one of the big reasons for that is that we do know so little about it.
Yeah.
And science changes on a dime when new evidence is presented.
Yeah.
Scientists in general don't typically have a problem saying, oh yeah, okay, we're just going to add this to what we know now. You know, this is the new normal. Now, sometimes you'll get researchers that have banked an entire career on something and they may have a hard time adjusting to the new normal.
Right.
But for the most part, when something gets discovered, accepted, written about, and then, you know, peer reviewed and the whole thing, then it just gets accepted into the norm. And some people may take that as evidence or proof that scientists don't know what they're talking about. And it's wrong. It's science. Science changes and modifies itself.
Yeah, you have to be very willing to move with the times, especially when it comes to paleoanthropology, because you're talking about a time frame that is millions of years, 8 million years, right? Like,
give or take.
Yeah. So like,
some would argue like 20 million years, depending on how far you go back.
Exactly, depending on how far you want to consider human ancestors. So like, you've just got this huge amount of time, and you're always filling in those in between spaces with more fossils, which give you a bigger picture of the story. And sometimes that story takes you in a direction that you weren't expecting, and you have to be willing to kind of pivot and go with it. And I feel like the younger you are, the more willing you are to like pivot and go with it. And like the older you are and the more like set in your ways, maybe not. That might be a little age discrimination there. So my apologies to anybody who feels differently, but yeah, you know, that's how it is.
All right. Well, let's get into this.
Yeah.
So for this first part and the remainder of this segment, and possibly a little more, we are going to talk about Homo Neanderthalensis.
Right.
Yes. Now let's talk about the name first.
Yes.
Okay.
Let's do that.
A lot of people say Neanderthal,
yes,
which is common, even amongst researchers and the like. We say Neanderthal because that's actually how it's pronounced. Tal, T-H-Al, I believe means valley in German. I heard one time it was like High German. I didn't even know there was a High German, but, you know.
Like fancy German?
Fancy German, yeah. Like Tal means valley. I don't know if that's true or not, but...
No, I think you're correct from what I was reading. Like it's the Neander Valley, but when you put the THAL on the end of it, that is what is the valley part of it. So it's Neanderthal.
Right.
But
you're not necessarily incorrect by saying Neanderthal. People will know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
Now, I've also heard that since the word Neanderthal has come to be somewhat of a derogatory term for certain facial features and attitudes.
Yes.
That when you're referring to those things, it's okay to say Neanderthal. But when you're referring to the fossil species that is a ancestral line of the human lineage and possibly related to us, it's Neanderthal.
Yes. And
so don't be a Neanderthal and not say Neanderthal.
I would argue that we should remove Neanderthal from our language as a barbaric precursor to humans, because it is not at all what they might have thought it was back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, when this sort of caveman mentality about Neanderthals was going on. So we can talk about that more in a little bit, but
they were pretty smart in their own right.
They were. They very much were. Yeah.
So the Homo Neanderthalensis, which is the Latin genus and species name of this particular species. Notice Homo in the title.
Yes.
So Homo Sapiens, Homo Neanderthalensis. It means they're part of the human line. They lived about 400,000 years ago to about 40,000 years ago.
And they occupied the Europe and Asia region from Europe eastward to Central Asia, and it was from as far north as present day Belgium, and then as far south as the Mediterranean and Southwest Asia. So it's this kind of huge swath, but when you look at it on a map, it's kind of all in the same latitude, right? It's this band across Europe and Asia where they did live and thrive, really.
Yeah, and as we mentioned earlier, the very first fossil that was identified as a new species was found in 1864, and again named after the Neander Valley where it was found by geologist William King.
Who might be your ancestor.
I mean, my grandfather was James King, or Jim King, and we do have German ancestry in our line.
So you very much could be related to him. Who knows?
I am almost certainly a Neanderthal.
Are you going to go get on Ancestry.com right now to find out?
with what we're paying for it every month, I may as well.
Oh, man.
That's a little relationship dig right there.
Hey now, get off of my ancestry. I love it. Anyway.
All right.
So 1864, of course, was the first identified Neanderthal. The first identified Neanderthal fossil. But there were several earlier fossils that have been categorized as Neanderthal later on. And that makes the first one actually discovered in like 1829. So,
which is another common thing. Like a lot of major discoveries in science have been made in museums.
Yes. Yeah. Like they found this thing and they're like, we don't really know what it is. We're going to put it over here. Right. And then,
or it's misclassified.
Yeah, totally. And then 50 years later, they're like, oh, right. That's totally Neanderthal. Cool. Thanks.
Yeah. I mean, this was actually my thesis, was going over a collection that had been recorded and somewhat written about a little bit back in Georgia. It was recorded back in the 70s. It was a reservoir project. And people kind of knew, according to my thesis advisor, that there was some special kind of pottery within here, but nobody knew exactly how much because nobody had ever gone through it.
Right.
So I went through, and there was this whole special type of pottery that's relatively rare in Georgia, and my site was loaded with it.
Yeah.
So now it became like one of the biggest sources.
Typology sites.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. It was almost a type site for that kind of pottery. I don't know if it is because I don't know if it's the oldest one, but it's the one at that time that had the most on it. So a lot of discoveries are made by just reanalyzing stuff. And I mean, really, that's what grad students are for. Go through there, do a project, and find some new things.
Totally. Well, Neanderthals probably share a common ancestor with Homo sapiens, and it is likely the Homo Heidelbergensis. But we don't know for sure because the fossil record, like we said, is millions of years, right? And we just have gaps, and there are always going to be gaps in the fossil record. And that's, I just don't ever see it being like fully filled in where we're like, yes, this is absolutely exactly the way that the tree branched. But anyway, with Homo Heidelbergensis, it was probably around 400 to 600,000 years ago. And that's probably when the split happened, but we just don't really know for sure.
And let's talk about some definitions real quick here. We're going to do a lot of kind of generalizing here in the first segment, just so we can set the stage. What does a common ancestor mean?
Yeah, totally.
So a common ancestor means that there was something in the past that looked different than Homo sapiens and Neanderthals, but generated both species. Right. And that's pretty obvious, right? I mean, if you look at siblings even, sure, they're related, but they look very different. And if you get enough of that going on with genetic mutations, well, somebody's going to be born that's very different.
Right.
And, and again, it's not like you have this mutant child. It happens over thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of years.
Yeah. The way that genetics affect populations can be really crazy, and it happens in really crazy different ways too. And I mean, that's what causes evolution to happen, right? Is like the way that genetics affects the population that we're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, the common thing that people like to say that really don't understand science or evolution is if humans, which is a weird thing to say, evolved from monkeys, why are there still monkeys? Yeah. Humans didn't evolve from monkeys.
No.
Humans and monkeys evolved from a common ancestor. Yes. That's why we're both primates.
Yeah.
So there was some weird ape monkey-like thing 20 million years ago, and it's about the time frame when the whole great ape and like primate line that is of that's not Homo sapiens, but it's the ape line, they started diverging in their own right. And there's lots of different species of great ape. And there ended up being lots of different species of Homo sapiens. The only difference is we killed all of our competition and they did not.
Yeah.
So now they have there's a lot of variation within that group, and there's little variation within the Homo sapien line. There used to be a lot of coexistent species, which is kind of the whole point of this podcast.
Yeah, that's totally what we're talking about today, because these guys were all coexisting, which is really interesting. But yeah, you have to think of human evolution as branches coming off of each other rather than this like linear thing. It's not like one became the next, became the next, became the next. It's like there was one back here, 20 million years ago or whatever it was, that branched off and became the great apes. And then a little further down the line, you got another branch where you've got, some of the earlier hominid species that split off from each other. And then those ones that didn't make it, they just sort of split off and then they died, right? That's how it worked. The ones that made it to where we are now, it's not a linear thing, but it's definitely the hardiest of the bunch, right? It's a final twig on the end of a branch, right? Yeah. It's a little sprout on the end of the branch. That's what we are, the ones that finally made it all the way to the end of the branch.
Yep. All right. Well, let's take a break. And on the other side, we'll come back and talk about what these Neanderthals looked like. And I did say that derogatorily. Back in a minute.
Chicken tacos should only be trusted to chicken professionals.
That's where we come in. Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One comes with pico de gallo and creamy chipotle ranch. And the other comes with bacon, lettuce, tomato, and avocado ranch. Chicken experts since 1990. Chicken taco experts since now. Order yours today in the Zax Rewards app. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop the latest school styles with an extra 25% off during Tanger Style, our biggest sale of the season, now through August 25th. Plan your trip at tanger.com.
Welcome back to episode 160 of the Krog and Grog Show. No.
We didn't even say where we were in the first segment.
Oh, yeah. We're in California.
We are in California. We're on our way to the SCAs, actually. So if anybody is going to be there.
At the Society for California Archaeology meetings.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to be there doing the Wild Note booth. So come by and see us.
Yeah. If you happen to listen to this in 2022, in late February.
Sometime in the next, week or so.
Right. Yeah. Come by and see us. If you just happen to be in Visalia, California, maybe we can meet up anyway for some coffee or something.
Oh, yeah,
we'll be there
totally.
a whole week.
Yep.
But I mentioned the Krog and Grog Show only because, we're going to talk about what they look like. But I was thinking over the break that a lot of people tend to equate Neanderthals with caveman.
Yeah.
But technically a caveman is a really old Homo sapien.
Right.
They weren't Neanderthals.
Yeah.
Yeah. They were just cave dwelling. Well, Neanderthals did dwell in caves.
They did. They weren't necessarily only Neanderthals. And because they lived in caves didn't mean it was a bad thing necessarily.
Right.
There's so much to unpack in the whole caveman thing.
They had brontosaurus based excavating devices and, all kinds of things. So
No. I mean, it is true that a lot of the best and most well-preserved Neanderthal fossils are found in caves, but that is just because the cave environment is very well-suited to preservation.
That's a good point, because it's a biased sample. It makes you think that that's where they lived.
Yeah.
But that's just where their stuff preserved the best.
Exactly. Yeah. It's so I if there's one thing that people can take away from this is that Neanderthals did not 100% live in caves and only have cave life as their main places they lived.
It's like in our RV here, 99% of our ice cubes live in the freezer. Is that where they were born? Did they just live their whole lives out there?
They were actually born there.
They were actually born there.
Yeah, they were.
It is their environment.
That's not really a very good.
That's actually terrible.
You're so dumb.
All right. What do they look like?
So Neanderthals were relatively short and stocky as compared to modern Homo sapiens. The males would average around 5'5" and be 143-ish pounds, and females were
That's oddly specific.
I know. Well, this is from this one particular article who's balancing out amongst all of the different fossils that have been found. And then the females averaged about 5'1" and they were 119 pounds. So fairly small, but also short and definitely stocky. So yeah.
And their facial features, long, low skull cap, prominent brow ridge, which is probably the thing that people most think about when you think of Neanderthals. And large eye sockets, large wide nose, large front teeth, reduced chin. All the stuff in the facial regions that you would think of. And it's mostly because the facial reconstructions that started coming out, 20, 30, 40 years ago were really emphasizing these kinds of things.
They were especially the brow ridge, right?
Yeah.
But I did read that the large eye sockets meant that they might have had like larger eyes than we do. That might be an adaptation to like a low light environment. And I'm not sure why they would need, like why the environment would be lower light than
Because it's always cloudy in Europe.
Yeah, maybe.
No, caves.
Because they only lived in caves.
Because they always lived in caves.
That's so silly, though. They had to leave caves to get food. So I don't know how I feel about that idea, but it is one thing that I did read.
Right.
And then there's some evidence that the large nose that they had, and you see these reconstructions, right? And they've got this like super large bulbous nose. And there is some evidence that maybe that large nose was to warm and moisten the cold, dry air that they were breathing in. Yeah. But there's a little bit of like pushback on that because they lived all across Europe and into Asia, and not all of those areas had super cold, and they weren't super cold environments all the time. So
yeah, and here's the thing with stuff like that too. Like Homo Sapiens have been around. We're going to get to this in the next segment, but Homo Sapiens have been around for a few 100,000 years too. Why don't we have big noses? Why don't we in the last 1,000 years, why haven't our eyes gotten bigger? Because we live inside all the time.
Yeah, totally. Like we would see some effects of the same genetic adaptations if that were true. And I'm not sure I totally buy that. Maybe it's possible, but there's also some like idea that maybe it was from genetic drift. And I did do a little bit of a deep dive on genetic drift because it's so fascinating. But basically what genetic drift is that in a small population, some genetic traits will be favored over others. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they are the best genetic traits or the most common. It just means that because the population is small, one gets favored over another, and then all of a sudden it just like is throughout the entire population. Yeah. So like one big nosed dude might have like spread his like genes. Real prolific. Yeah, exactly. Like he might have spread his genes early on in the population, and then all of a sudden everybody had a big nose, and that's just the way it happened. Yeah. So, and that can be true of all of the weird genetic stuff that you see with Neanderthals because they had a very small population size.
Right. Yeah, and genetic drift and, genetic mutation that is favored through typically sexual selection are the two ways that evolution largely happens in species like this. Right. And what we mean by that is, okay, so there's the genetic drift with, relatively prolific beings, but also, certain traits, depending on whether they're dominant or recessive, and you mate with another person, dominant, recessive, they just get propagated, and it has nothing necessarily to do with... Well, it all has to do with sex because you don't make more things unless you have sex. Right. So the thought that, we, like I just said, might get bigger eyes because we spend a lot of time indoors, more so than our ancestors did, is kind of a weird thing to say because you would either need everybody to experience that and some few people to be born with better eyes, and then those people have to have sex and then proliferate, and it goes faster if it's a sexually selected trait. Right. So some of our traits back in the day were, having bigger brains to be able to find food easier and quicker and, just do better things. And, females and males alike will be attracted to those kinds of things because they can better provide for the family. Right. So they'd be more likely if there's a pack of females sitting there and two males walk up and, one's carrying an ibex and the other one's just got like a rabbit. You're going to go for the big guns, right? Go for the guy. Yeah. The big one. So. Which is an interesting thing, like going back to the nose, because like we don't necessarily know what was attractive to Neanderthals. Like we don't know what the women liked or what the men liked. Apparently big noses.
But maybe they did. I kind of love the idea that Neanderthals were like, you with the big nose. Get over here, sir.
Wow. It's odd too because, I just can't imagine anybody smelled very good back then. But then again, that's all like a natural scent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe that was a good smell.
Yeah, maybe. Like it was very just what people smelled like and no adjustments based on modern stuff that we have now. So, yeah. Well, the Neanderthals did have a very small population, and I don't think that they ever got much larger than around 25,000. And that would be the effective population. And effective means adults that could that could either father a child or bear a child. So men and women who could have a child.
And that's
basically.
at any one time.
It was increasing throughout the time that they occupied Europe, and 25,000 is probably at the height of that, which would have been in the like 40 to 60,000 years ago range is when they reached that. But that's still quite small, really. Like that's not a huge population at all. And this is in part because of the Bozarupian trap. So the Bozarupian trap is this idea that the population might have been limited by both the available resources and also technological innovation. And it's like one feeds the other, right? So because the resources are small or low, they don't necessarily develop the technology to increase the resources, and it's just like this loop that they get stuck in, right?
Yeah, I mean, if the available resources are low, and resources usually means food and clothing and stuff like that, which clothing usually comes from your food. But it's interesting that I would really want to look into that, because it's interesting because the available resources were probably lower because their available technological innovation wasn't there to get other resources.
Exactly.
Right. So the ones that they're going after, they're spending all their time doing that and don't have time to figure out how to get other stuff.
Yeah. Like they never, and some of the evidence for being stuck in this like trap, quote unquote trap, is that their lithic technology never really advanced. Not in the 100,000 years that they were in Europe and living and doing their thing. They never really advanced beyond the lithic technologies that we see, at any of the sites. So that's why that's a thought that might be going on. They sort of got stuck in this loop and never really got out of it.
Yeah, they also didn't live very long either.
They did not.
Pretty high infant mortality rate of around 43%, and also a high adult mortality rate around 80%, with a lot of them dying before the age of 40.
Yeah.
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 You've got like a couple good years left in you. If you got any Neanderthal genes in you.
You're well past your expiration date, buddy.
Any moment now. I'm just going to end up in a cave.
So back to their like body shape, that stocky build and shorter limbs that they probably had, it might have helped preserve warmth. And we are talking about them being around in the last glacial maximum, right? So it was very cold, especially Northern Europe when they were trying to, live and hunt and do all the things they need to do to survive. So the robust skeletons that we see does indicate that they were quite muscular, probably. Their brain size was larger, but it was in proportion to their body size. So I don't really know if that means that that doesn't necessarily mean that they were like smarter or anything. It just, they had a larger brain in proportion to the more robust bodies that they had.
So we mentioned their lithic technology, and one of the things that Neanderthals are basically known for is what's called the Mousterian tradition. And the Mousterian tradition, it's, again, things are named based off where they're found and things like that. I keep thinking it's like the Mousketeers, but it's not, because it looked like Mousterian, but it's Mousterian. But that's a type of Lavois stone tool tradition, and the Lavois shaping, if you will, it has to do with, basically taking a core, a source material, knocking flakes off when they need them, and then modifying the flake edges. But it's a little more than that, because the Lavois technique it's really kind of shaping a core and then knocking off like one whole side of that core.
Yeah, like one single flake. It's like, from what I was reading, it's like you set up a striking platform basically, and then you knock off all the flakes around that striking platform, and then when you're ready, when you need an actual tool, you hit that platform that you've already created and knock that one whole side of the core off, like you said, or the whole large flake. And because you've already sharpened it, you've pre-sharpened it basically by taking all those flakes off, and you have this tool that's like immediate and ready to go. It's kind of cool, right? Like you're carrying this core around, and it's not a tool yet, but it could be the second that you need it to be, assuming you're skilled enough to pull that flake off without breaking it.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they use these tools and other techniques to likely ambush their prey.
Yeah.
And, not incredibly sophisticated hunting techniques, as probably indicated by their population size.
Yeah.
They would ambush their prey. This is what we think anyway. And their diet was dominated by protein they would get from hunting. And there is some evidence they may have eaten some grains as well. So now, as far as other stuff goes, they more than likely, because they lived in groups, and there's evidence of of other things, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit here, but they must have had at least a rudimentary language.
They had to have, because, and they look at this in the skeletal record too. Like you can see in the hyoid
one.
Yes, the hyoid bone shows that they probably had the ability for language. Now, what they did with that ability, we don't know, obviously, but there was at least some ability to vocally communicate with other people.
You can see skeletally. Well, that's a cool word. Skeletally. Skeletally.
Skeletally.
You can tell that a species, and we've seen this in other, pre-human species, that, did they have the ability to make sounds that we're familiar with? Now, it's a little elitist in my mind that, somebody that doesn't have a developed hyoid bone to make the sounds that we can make today around the world with the different languages that we have. If you don't have that, it doesn't mean that you can't still make sounds and communicate.
Right.
And there's also non-vocal ways of communicating as well.
There's so many ways to communicate.
So, we talk about dolphins having a language.
Yeah.
Why couldn't early humans have a language, early Homo species?
It's a really good point. It's very important to keep in mind that this is a vocal language that we're talking about. I'm sure they had many other ways of communicating.
But some of the other things that lead to the fact that they more than likely communicated with each other. And when you talk about communication, it's not just, hey, I'll go this way, you go that way, and we'll both get the gazelle. It's more like, communicating thoughts and feelings and things like that, because we do have evidence that they had, it's a little sketchy, but there was a possible flute, which was actually made out of a long bone. Yeah. I remember seeing this a long time ago when it came out, but there was a possible, I think they still call it like the earliest or the first musical instrument that's ever been found. Yeah. I think it was around 40 to 50,000 years.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And they call it a flute because it's got holes bored in it that look very uniform. And the people that disagree with it are saying, oh, those holes came from scavenger animals. It wasn't done on purpose, blah, blah, blah. But I don't know. Like looking at the pictures, it looks like it was really a flute. And I think that the only thing that is, making me skeptical is that it's found from a time period that overlaps with humans. So it might have been from a Homo Sapien group rather than a Neanderthal group. Yeah. But either way, like 40,000 years ago, having a flute is really cool.
Plus, did Grog just pick up a long bone while sitting around the fire after it had kind of lost all its marrow and it was old and was sitting there? And they do kind of hollow themselves out naturally if it just sits there. And what crazy Neanderthal bastard just picked this thing up and started blowing on it and it made a sound.
And figured out how to make sounds out of it. That's
and then
cool.
It maybe had a hole in it and he had his finger over it, or she did.
Yep.
And then noticed that the tone changed. There's a lot to put together to come up with a flute.
There is.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah. Well, we know that these guys were smart. We know it.
Yeah.
They cared for their sick. There's evidence of this one skeleton where the whole arm was amputated.
Yeah.
And you don't do that unless you're trying to help somebody survive. You don't cut off an arm for no reason. It's because you want them to live. Something is wrong with that arm and you want to get rid of it so they can live, And
we know it was amputated because we have other examples as well.
Yeah.
You can see when something is cut, and if the person dies right away, there's no further growth.
Right.
So you can see evidence of healing.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so we have that, and then we have other examples where, remains have been found with healed bone fractures. That's not to say the person didn't take care of themselves, but a lot of times
you need help for that, and that, who knows what other stuff they were helping them heal from. This is just what presents in the skeletal catalog, right? Who knows what else they were potentially recovering from with help from their fellow Neanderthals.
There's also evidence that they buried their dead and took care of them. There was a burial found a while back that had possibly some flowers and stuff in it.
Yeah.
I think that was the one from Shanidar Cave from Israel, I think is
so.
That was.
Yeah.
But and then there's evidence of personal adornment, pendants, things like that. So
they were kind of like magpies. They just to collect really pretty things, and then they put holes in them and make them into necklaces because why not?
Plus a little chemistry. There is evidence that they may have painted with red ochre and black pigments and cave paintings and the like. So
and I saw some evidence too of scratching lines into the floors of caves too. So it's not quite petroglyphs or rock art, but it definitely was man-made. Well, Neanderthal made or human made. So
Sure.
very interesting.
All right. Well, let's take a break. And on the other side, in the final segment, we're gonna gloss over Homo sapiens a little bit because we kind of did a deep dive on Neanderthals.
Yeah.
But then we'll talk a little bit
They're
about
so
their intersection.
interesting, though. Like Neanderthals are so interesting. Sorry, other Homo sapiens. They're more interesting than you.
People are driven by the search for better. But when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. The hiring process can be slow and overwhelming. Simplify hiring with Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform. With over 350 million global monthly visitors according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. That's Indeed.com/PODKATZ12. Terms and conditions apply.
Back to school savings are officially in session at Tanger Outlets. Shop the latest school styles with an extra 25% off during Tanger Style, our biggest sale of the season, now through August 25th. Plan your trip at Tanger.com.
Welcome back to episode 160 of the Paleoanthropology Show.
I know, right?
I'm your Neanderthal host.
I think you should call it the Neanderthal Show because, we
show.
have definitely gone down a rabbit hole about Neanderthals in this episode.
It's the Neanderthal Show, but I am a Neanderthal reporting on Neanderthals.
You are a Neanderthal.
That's right.
But like I said in the beginning, we are going to cancel that word in regards to people acting like cavemen because it's not accurate.
That's right.
Yep.
Cave persons.
Cave persons. Excuse me.
We don't want to get canceled. Okay.
I already canceled you. So.
I know. That's right. All right. So let's talk about Homo sapiens in the first part of this segment here.
Yeah.
So human evolution, as we've already talked about, is nonlinear.
Right. It is a branching tree, and Neanderthals, which we spent so much time on, are just one of those branches.
And there's a reason to spend a lot of time on them. First off, I think more Neanderthal fossils have been found than pretty much any other Homo line.
Well, yeah, because they're the closest to us, right?
So they're the closest to us, and there was lots of them.
Yes.
They were all over Europe.
Well, lots of them is... I mean, the population level was always pretty small.
Lots of fossils.
There's lots of fossils, though, because I think that where they happen to be found, which does happen to be in caves, hence the caveman thing, but they're very well preserved. So we have lots of well-preserved fossils.
Right. So looking at the human line, the Homo line, I should say, which this would be theoretically a common ancestor with Neanderthals as well.
Yeah.
But one of the oldest, what we like to call human ancestors, and again, really depends on where you stop talking about it.
Yeah,
because you could
does.
go all the way back to the little mouse-like creatures that survived for the 65 million comet that killed the dinosaurs.
Exactly. We all got a common ancestor. Like, we're mammals, right? We all go back together somewhere.
We all go back to single-celled organisms. So, like I said, where do you want to stop it?
It's true.
So there's real quick, there's a book by a person who we've interviewed on this show before, Dr. John Marks, and it's called something like Being 98% Chimpanzee.
98% chimpanzee. Yeah.
And in that book, sorry, Dr. Marks, if you're listening to this, but I don't remember anything else from it except the one thing I always took away is not only are we 98% chimpanzee, that's how close we are to them in shared ancestry, but we're 77% dandelion. I'll never forget reading that. You know, because we all come from a common single-celled organism that spread out, and the entire genetic diversity of the whole planet is really not that big.
It's really not. It's so easy to look at the physical differences between things and think that translates to a huge genetic difference, but it really does.
Which is why if you change the oxygen in our atmosphere by like 1%, we'll literally all die.
We totally would. And like probably lizard men would become, the dominant species or something, right?
Lizard women probably. But anyway, this oldest human ancestor, approximately 6 million years ago, again, human, ... Sahelanthropus. And I believe it was... what was it? Sahelanthropus something or other. It's not just Sahelanthropus.
It's not. That's the genus, but I don't remember what the species was.
Well, anyway, I want to say Boisei, but that's not right.
No, it's not Boisei.
Yeah. Anyway, That was about 6 million years ago.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the fragments of it. I think this one was found in Chad about 15, 20 years ago.
Yeah.
It took another 5 million years before we even get close to Homo sapiens off of that.
Like that's the earliest one that we can say, okay, this is probably a common ancestor with humans.
Yeah.
But it's so different from what we are now that like it's way back in the human tree.
And some of our more ape-like ancestors that you may have heard of that developed along the way, around 3.2 million years ago or so, was Australopithecus afarensis, which is Lucy. And a little on the naming conventions again, Austral means southern. So southern ape is what this is. But Australopithecus and afarensis, she was found in the Afar region of Egypt.
Okay.
So, Egypt, Ethiopia.
Yeah, I was going to say,
the
I
Afar
thought,
region of Ethiopia,
yeah, which we saw her.
Yeah,
isn't that so cool that we've actually seen her? That's amazing.
Yeah,
but,
it was a while back when the fossils were touring the United States.
Yeah, I don't think
cool.
they come back to the States now, but this was 15 years ago or so. But
yeah, and there's another one which I don't know a whole lot about as far as time period goes, but it's Ardipithecus ramidus or Artie.
Yeah,
we always have little common cute
little
nicknames.
names. Yeah. Those are just some of the more famous ones, and just along in that several million years old range. Before we get to humans.
And there's even debate on whether or not they're even in the Homo line.
Yeah.
Like they may have been just completely separate branches that maybe went back so far that you wouldn't even call it the Homo line.
Like maybe we haven't found the fossil that is the common ancestor between us and Australopithecus afarensis.
Sure.
Like we might not have found that common ancestor yet.
Right.
But for what we know, it's probably there somewhere. And for what we know right now, we just put it into the same like tree somewhere together.
Well, like I said, you go back 20 million years and you start splitting off the line that became chimpanzees and the line that became Homo sapiens. And it's possible that Australopithecus afarensis could be on that other line.
Yeah.
And you have to go back 20 million years just to find the common ancestor.
Yeah, totally.
But we'll never know because DNA doesn't live that long.
Yep.
So just kind of like looking at these traits and seeing how they change is really how we do this. But anyway, these were more ape-like ancestors, these ones that were from probably about 2 million years on back. All the ones that don't have Homo in the name, they have Australopithecus, Ardipithecus, there's a bunch of them. All those are very ape-like, small and ape-like, lived in trees a lot, things like that. By the time we get to the Homo line, we could start getting a lot taller, more upright, larger brains. They were not knuckle draggers anymore.
Yep.
And we started getting into more Homo-related species, and one of the earlier ones was Homo erectus, which some later on after for various reasons you'd have to dig into the paleoanthropological text for this.
There's always a lot of drama there. Right?
Erectus becomes ergaster, Homo ergaster in some cases, and it might have just been Homo ergaster is was a differently defined species, and some of the ones that we thought were erectus were actually reclassified as ergaster.
Again, it goes back to that branching tree,
it's lumpers
right?
and splitters.
So
in the paleoanthropology line, it's all about lumpers and splitters.
What does that mean?
If you find something, do you lump it in with something that was already found, or do you make a new thing? And there's all this drama. Back in the day, the leakies were big on this. People talking about the leakies, saying every time they found something new, it was a brand new species, so they could write more books.
Right.
So they called them splitters.
Because they wanted to get the fame and
because if you lump it in, nobody cares if you found another one. But if you can define a whole new thing. So one of the ways, however, that we're really helping to define all this stuff is by looking at genes, because fossils only go so far. I mean, they're essentially rocks now, and they've been modified by the fossilization process a little bit. They, there is a lot that they can tell us, but there's also a lot of, damage and modification that happens during the fossilization process. But if we can,
it's very subjective too, because it's all about the morphology, right? So it's like you look at it and you're like, oh, this looks like this thing. But to somebody else, it could look different. So like when you're only talking about the morphology, like that gets a little difficult.
For some reason, it's okay in paleoanthropology to look at a skull and say, this looks different, therefore different.
Yeah.
But if we were to do that, we do that to people today, you're a racist. Like it just doesn't work that way. Well, and part of the reason is you can have two people that look very, very different on this planet, but their skulls look virtually identical.
They look the same. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like Homo sapiens today, no matter what your race or where you're from, like probably all look the same for the most part.
There are some differences. And
There
you
can be some regional differences, but
you can actually determine a little bit, what part of the world somebody might be from by studying these minute differences.
yeah, but there's there's a whole lot of racism built into that. Like I took a whole lot of classes in college about this, and like when I was in school, it was still kind of like an accepted thing to like identify race based on your skeleton, and I think that's kind of been like rejected since then because it's just too hard. There might be some characteristics that are more common in some regions than others, but that does not necessarily mean that is therefore where they're from.
I mean, it's 2022. The more mixing and things that goes on of people from different areas. I mean, there's no race anymore.
No, totally not when it comes to skeletons anyway. Now, socially speaking, that's a totally different thing, but
indeed. Yeah. All right. So, glossing over DNA real quick here. Sorry, we're going to move through some stuff. But anyway, some of the oldest recovered DNA from early human relatives comes from, there's a bunch of caves out there, again, preserving really cool stuff, but the Cima de los Huesos, the pit of bones in Spain's... Huesos?
Huesos. Yep.
Huevos rancheros. That's what I want now. Anyway, huesos.
It's huevos rancheros.
Oh, huesos rancheros. Pit of bones and eggs. That's what I want. Anyway, it's the pit of bones in Spain's Atapuerca Mountains. The teeth, weirdly, from like 28 people were found. I'm thinking it's like the world's first serial killer.
Super weird.
What's going on there?
Sure.
Right?
Maybe everything else was decomposed enough that it wasn't there anymore. But teeth are that enamel just like stays forever.
I always go back to the movie Snatch, where the guy, one of the evil guys, was, he used pigs to chew up his enemies. But he says you got to pull the teeth out because the pigs don't like it; they can't digest them. So maybe an animal ate a bunch of people, and like the teeth just were left.
Yeah, no, like that's not, no.
That's actually real though.
It is real.
Yeah.
But like probably they just decomposed.
They were more likely eaten. Listen, if it's a cave, it's pretty well known that like cheetahs and stuff and other animals will drag things into a cave and eat them.
That's true. You're right.
Anyway, using these partial genomes, they've worked out that the earliest Neanderthals were probably around 430,000 years old. And the common ancestor between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens probably lived sometime between 550,000 to 750,000 years.
Yeah, that's so cool. And that is probably the Homo Heidelbergensis. But we don't know for sure. We just know that we've got the Neanderthals up in Europe and we've got Homo sapiens down in Africa, and like, they did diverge for a little while. So yeah.
But looking at this and knowing exactly when Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens is actually pretty hard. It's a vast complex of things, and it's just something that we'll never really know.
Yeah.
Some of the most common evidence puts Homo sapiens back around 195,000 years as definitively Homo sapien.
Yeah.
And there's archaic Homo sapiens and all the like, but that's generally accepted. So let's talk about a little bit about this intersection, which was the whole prompting of this entire thing. So when Homo sapiens moved on to the European landscape, really, let's step back just a real second there. How did they get to Europe and why? There are a lot of theories on whether or not it's called the out of Africa hypothesis or the, what is the one where the multi-regional hypothesis.
The one that's wrong.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So basically, did species evolve independently in different areas and come together, or did they, and they would have evolved from common ancestors anyway, but were they kind of on the brink of Homo sapien and became Homo sapiens in different areas and then moved in, or did they develop into Homo sapiens mostly in Africa and then spread into different areas, which conversely would mean that Neanderthals kind of developed around Africa too, and moved into the European areas. Yeah. So
I think that's why the whole Homo Heidelbergensis is the common ancestor that we know of. There might be something more recent that we just haven't found yet. But the idea is that is the common ancestor. One of those Heidelbergensis people moved into Europe, and then Neanderthals and Denisovans, which we haven't even really talked about, but they both developed from that ancestor that had moved into the Europe and Asia area. Whereas another Heidelbergensis relative stayed in Africa, and that's where the Homo sapien line developed from. And then later on, those Homo sapiens moved out of Africa and into Europe. Right. So they did, evolutionarily speaking, develop separately, but they shared that common ancestor from 100,000 years earlier or whatever it was.
Yeah. And there is evidence that Homo sapiens moved into Europe as far back as 210,000 years ago, which is a long time.
That would be the Neanderthals, though, right?
No, Homo sapien.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Neanderthals were already there at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Homo sapiens 210,000 years ago, possibly because there's a skull fragment found in Greece called the Apodemia skull fragment that dates back to more than 200,000 years ago. And it might be the oldest out of Africa fossil on the Homo sapien line. Yeah. So
I wonder,
the dating is in question, of course.
That's
as
interesting.
It always is.
But like you have to think of it too, like these are still people that we're talking about, and like sure, maybe a group of people moved out of Africa, they settled somewhere, and then like stuff didn't go their way, and then they died out. I'm sure that happened on multiple occasions in multiple places. So yeah.
Now, most leading theories these days point to humans basically developing in Africa, and I say humans, but I mean Homo sapiens developing in Africa, and then moving out beginning around 50 to 60,000 years ago, and basically dominating all other species.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And the whole reason that we're talking about this is that definitely they did move from Africa into Europe, into Asia, and then interact with Neanderthals and Denisovans. Denisovans were a little bit more Asian on the Asian side of things, whereas Neanderthals were on the Europe side of things. So, but they developed like simultaneously, and then the Homo sapiens moved in and interacted with both of those populations.
Yeah.
And it seems like they interbred, and various traits that, are common in humans were passed on through the Neanderthal DNA. Yeah. I read one was potentially like being more susceptible to type 2 diabetes. It's nice. Potentially from a Neanderthal ancestor. So like there's a lot of things that we see in our DNA today that comes from the mixing with Neanderthals, at least the European, because this is European people. So anybody with European ancestry probably has some Neanderthal DNA.
Well, the diabetes makes sense because I was always personally sure that Neanderthals died out because all they did was sit around and eat candy. So, that's pretty much didn't do anybody any good.
Yeah, no, they didn't like hunt or kill.
Oh, it was just candy.
Animals and
Cave
stuff.
Candy.
Totally.
Yeah, rock candy really is what they like to eat.
Really?
Yeah,
sure.
That's where that comes from.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, sure, for sure.
No.
One of the cool things about this time period, though, and it's just this really cool intersection of things that were happening, right? And one of the things that allowed humanity partially to at least spread out as quickly as they did was lowering sea levels.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot of stuff that blocks Africa from like a lot of things, right? Now, you can, back in the time before the Suez Canal was dug, you could just walk across, right? But lowering sea levels made those journeys a little bit shorter. And it's not like they were, hey, let's go to Europe. They're like, let's go up there now.
Just following whatever it was, game, fish, whatever.
Seasonal patterns, all kinds of stuff. But they were in a little bit of another ice age between 45 and about 60,000 years ago. This is also the time that is commonly accepted that people first came to Australia and they walked there for the most part. They didn't walk there like specifically, but they could walk a lot of the way.
They just followed the land,
and then like float. And it's not like they had boats, but raft type things.
Yeah.
I mean, from what I understand, there's models that show that you could practically see Australia from some of the southern land bits that were exposed.
Yeah, totally.
And of course, Australia would have been out a little further as well, because with lower sea levels, because there's more ice, that's what creates lower sea levels. So
yeah, totally.
But anyway, it basically took less than 50,000 years for humans to populate pretty much every part of the planet, which is pretty crazy.
Yeah.
And it didn't take long for Neanderthals to die out, but I think I think it's pretty well accepted because if you get a DNA test, there's a good chance you've got Neanderthal DNA in you.
I know, we totally should, because we're both like European ancestry, right?
Yeah,
so
you've got
like
one hell of a brow ridge.
Oh, I do?
Yeah.
Please.
I'm just saying.
Let's just take a look at your brow ridge, sir.
Lady Krog.
You know what? If I do have Neanderthal DNA, I would be so proud of that, because I think that's amazing. Like, look at how just persistent they were, right? Like, it doesn't matter that they were not able to compete with the Homo sapiens that were moving into their territory. So great. They interbred with them and they managed to move their DNA along through the surviving human line. I think that is really great. And I want to see a movie. Yeah, you're trying to end this, but just wait. I want to see... I want a romance movie or a romance book between like a Homo sapien and a Neanderthal and like the forbidden love that might happen between them. And I want that story to be written by somebody.
Pretty sure it's called Clan of the Cave Bear.
No.
Isn't that part of the intersection between Homo sapiens and like
it is
early humans?
Yeah, it is. But like, it's
I've
not.
never read it.
I read it, but it's not quite like that. It's not quite like that. And Arya makes all of the discoveries. So
all right.
Arya.
That's from Game of Thrones.
Yeah, that's Game of Thrones. I don't remember. Anyway.
All right. Well, if anybody's going to be a Neanderthal, like, it's definitely a bunch of Italians, aka Rachel and her family. All right. So
rude. Well, wait. So circling back to the article that we talked about last week, basically what set us on this path is that human occupation of Europe has been pushed back by about 10,000 years, potentially, with this most recent article.
Yeah.
So a time period that we thought was not occupied by humans was maybe they were there and intermixing with Neanderthals, which just gives more time for this inbreeding between the two populations to happen, and adds more like credence to the idea that the populations were intermingling, and that's why we have so much Neanderthal DNA in us today. So
that's right.
Yeah.
All right. Well, with that, we are going to take this podcast, put it on a shelf, throw it in a box in a museum, because that's where it belongs. And maybe come back to it in 10 or 15 years and find out how wrong we were. Yeah.
We're probably like 10 or 15 months.
I have no doubt our listeners will tell us that shortly.
Yeah,
so,
totally.
Again, keep in mind, this was kind of a glossing over of a very complex history.
Yes.
We're not intending to give you a scholarly retelling of all the things that are happening, just some of the highlights. So if you want to do some more research, check out the links that we'll put in the show notes, and then, feel free to dig into this on your own. There's
Jump
a lot of
off
resources.
from there. There is so much to read about.
There's a lot of really cool books on paleoanthropology out there, written by some big names in the field. So
yeah, for sure.
All right. We'll see you next week. We got to get on the road.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Archaeology Show. Feel free to comment and view the show notes on the website at www.archpodnet.com. Find us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at ArchPodNet. Music for this show is called I Wish You Would Look from the band Sea Hero. Again, thanks for listening and have an awesome day. This episode was produced by Chris Webster from his RV traveling the United States, Tristan Boyle in Scotland, DigTech LLC, Culturo Media, and the Archaeology Podcast Network, and was edited by Chris Webster.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Introducing Zaxby's new chicken finger tacos. One with pico and creamy chipotle ranch, and the other with bacon and avocado ranch. Chicken expert since 1990. Taco expert since now. Woo, saucy! Zaxby's.
.com.